In the winter of 1894, in the remote Highland settlement of Cariston Hollow, Scotland, a town swallowed by fog and generations of superstition, a case began that would eventually leave investigators, historians, and psychologists debating the true limits of human darkness. It began with a report so vague and so strangely worded that local authorities were unsure whether it was a complaint, a confession, or the ramblings of someone desperately trying to describe a nightmare. But before the world learned the truth, before court records revealed the layers of manipulation, coercion, and psychological terror that had unfolded behind closed doors, it began with a bitter morning and the sight of a barefoot teenage girl stumbling through the frost. Her name was Eleanor Marston, 17 years old, shaking violently, mud up to her knees, clothing torn from running through the woods all night. And when she collapsed on the steps of the parish office, many of the townspeople believed she was simply another runaway escaping poverty. But there was something in her eyes, an intensity, a hollowed-out vacancy that made the parish clerk hesitate before offering help. It was the kind of look people carried only when they had survived something that defied language. Before we go further, let me ask you something that many in our audience find strangely compelling. Where are you watching from? And what hour of the night or day have you stepped into this story? Because this is one of those cases where time and place make you feel as though you're standing inside the cold air of Cariston Hollow yourself, listening to the sound of a girl who seemed terrified not of what she had escaped, but of the possibility that it might come after her. When Eleanor was finally able to speak, her first words were not about danger, hunger, or injury. She whispered a single name: my father, Thomas. At first, that meant very little to the parish clerk. The town was small, but not so small that one man named Thomas stood out. It was only when Eleanor described where she lived, a decaying estate on the western edge of the hollow, that the clerk froze, because that house belonged to Thomas Alistair Marston, a widower, a land steward, and a man known for being disciplined, private, and fiercely protective of his daughter. What could have driven a girl like Eleanor to flee from a man the entire village respected? And why, when the clerk asked what she needed protection from, did she wince as though the very question pierced something inside her? These were the first tiny fractures in a story that would unravel into one of the most disturbing domestic crimes in Scottish history. A narrative that forced investigators to confront the chilling reality of how one person could twist another's life so completely that they no longer recognized where love ended and possession began. When authorities brought Eleanor into the constable's office later that morning, she was wrapped in a wool blanket and trembling less from the cold than from anticipation, like someone who expected punishment simply for breathing. Constable Harris, a man known for his direct manner and impatience with hysteria, asked her straightforward questions about what had happened in the Marston home. But Eleanor struggled to form sentences, often pausing mid-breath as though weighing whether truth itself could be dangerous. Each time Harris pressed her gently, she spoke a little more. She described years of isolation on the estate, long periods during which her father insisted she avoid villagers, avoid friends, avoid anyone outside the boundaries of their land. According to Eleanor, her father believed that outsiders corrupted innocence, that the world beyond the estate was filled with wickedness, dishonor, and betrayal. At first, this sounded almost like the strict upbringing common in the Victorian era. Overprotective, perhaps, but not criminal. But as Eleanor continued, details began to surface that made Harris quietly alert one of his deputies to start writing down every word. She described her father's obsession with morality, purity, and family lineage, how he spoke often of preserving their bloodline's singular strength after the death of Eleanor's mother, how he grew increasingly controlling, dictating where Eleanor stood, sat, read, and even how she dressed. These were not the instructions of a grieving widower. They were the rigid, delusional constructs of a man retreating into a world defined entirely by his own convictions. Yet, even then, the true horror had not been spoken aloud. Eleanor's voice cracked only when Harris asked what she feared most about returning to the estate. She looked up, tears gathering at the edges of her eyes, and uttered a phrase that left the room silent. "He doesn't want a daughter anymore." Harris didn't fully grasp the implication, but there was enough suggestion, enough fracture in her tone, to understand that the boundaries between fatherly guardianship and something far more twisted had been intentionally dismantled. This prompted immediate concern, but without concrete accusations or physical evidence, authorities were still uncertain how deeply wrongdoing extended. What made matters worse was Thomas Marston's reputation, a man of impeccable standing, charitable contributions, and warm public demeanor. How could such a respected figure be capable of creating the terror that now leaked from Eleanor's every breath? And more importantly, why did her fear seem rooted not in singular incidents, but in something ongoing, systematic, and psychologically consuming? Before officers could investigate further, Thomas Marston himself appeared in the village, not storming into the constable's office, but walking calmly, as though he had merely come to retrieve a misplaced item. Dressed in his dark wool coat, posture straight, every inch the composed Victorian gentleman, he approached Harris with an unsettling politeness. Claiming that Eleanor had experienced a nervous episode and wandered off in the night, he insisted she suffered from emotional disturbances brought on by her mother's death, that she imagined things, exaggerated harmless actions, and occasionally fled the home in moments of confusion. Thomas spoke so evenly, so rationally, that even Harris, who had just listened to Eleanor's trembling account, found himself momentarily disoriented. There was no aggression in Thomas's voice, no defensiveness, only calm, articulate concern. Yet behind his eyes, there was something difficult to name, a faint intensity that did not match the measured tone of his words. It was as though he was not worried for Eleanor's safety, but for maintaining control of a narrative. Investigators noticed this immediately, and when Thomas asked to see Eleanor, the trembling in her hands returned instantly. She shook her head, begging to stay in the office. At that moment, Harris quietly signaled to a deputy to escort Thomas outside, under the pretense of taking a statement elsewhere. Something deeper was clearly unfolding, something that could not be dismissed as emotional instability or misunderstandings. Why did Eleanor react as though a predator had entered the room? Why did Thomas seem more concerned with appearances than with the physical condition of his daughter? And why, when he briefly turned back toward the window where Eleanor sat, did his expression shift into a subtle, chilling smirk, gone so quickly that only one deputy caught it? As tensions rose quietly beneath the surface, the investigators realized that whatever truth lay behind the walls of the Marston estate, it would not reveal itself easily. But one thing was certain: Eleanor had run for a reason, and that reason was buried somewhere in the life she shared with a man who, according to her, had been slowly reshaping her existence into something she could no longer survive. The investigation into the Marston estate began quietly, without formal accusations, as Constable Harris and two deputies made their way up the frost-covered path leading to the old stone manor. The house loomed over the clearing like a monument to isolation, its shutters closed despite the morning light, its grounds unnervingly silent. The closer they walked, the more they sensed that Eleanor's fear had not been exaggerated. If anything, it had been constrained by the limits of language. Inside, the air felt stale, heavy, as though the rooms themselves had not breathed in years. What struck the investigators immediately was how little warmth the home carried. No signs of daily family life, no laughter, no clutter, no objects belonging to a young woman of 17. Instead, the manor was curated like a shrine, portraits hung precisely, candles arranged in straight lines, every piece of furniture positioned symmetrically. Almost nothing hinted at Eleanor's presence, except a single bedroom upstairs. That room revealed the first fracture of truth. Its shelves were bare. Its wardrobe held only plain dresses of identical cut and color. Its window was nailed shut from the outside. As Harris examined the nailed frame, he felt a slow, cold realization settle in his chest. Eleanor had not been living as a normal adolescent. She had been living according to someone else's rigid blueprint. A blueprint shaped by Thomas Marston. And as deputies searched further, they discovered journals written in Thomas's hand, filled not with rants or confessions, but with philosophical reflections about family, purity, lineage, continuity, and the moral decay of the outside world. None of the writings were explicit, yet each carried an undercurrent of a man who believed himself the arbiter of his household's destiny. The deeper they read, the clearer it became that Thomas had not been grieving his wife. He had been reconstructing his home around a dangerous ideology, one in which Eleanor existed less as a daughter and more as a symbol of continuity he believed only he could preserve. But how far had he taken this obsession? And if Eleanor's terror was rooted in something that had not yet been spoken, what boundaries had Thomas erased, twisted, or redefined behind these walls? Before investigators could collect enough for an immediate intervention, they needed Eleanor's full account. Yet she seemed haunted by a fear that speaking aloud would somehow summon consequences. The case balanced on a knife's edge, one side shaped by a girl's trembling honesty, the other by a man whose controlled demeanor cast doubt even on undeniable evidence. Over the following days, the inquiry deepened as doctors examined Eleanor and confirmed she bore no physical harm but clear signs of chronic stress, deprivation, and psychological conditioning. She flinched at sudden noises, apologized for speaking, and hesitated before answering simple questions as if years of silence had trained her to weigh every word. When placed in a safe house under supervision, she began revealing the truth slowly, piece by piece, like someone peeling back layers of a memory war she had been fighting alone. Eleanor explained that after her mother's death 6 years earlier, Thomas had changed completely. Once warm, patient, and affectionate, he withdrew into strict routines and sharp expectations. He dismissed Eleanor's attempts to socialize, forbidding school and church gatherings, convinced that outsiders corrupt innocence. At first, these restrictions seemed rooted in grief, but they hardened into something far more controlling. Thomas began insisting that Eleanor dress in clothing identical to her late mother's portrait. He forbade her from addressing him informally, insisting she speak with rehearsed politeness. He controlled her reading, limiting her to moral treatises and philosophical essays he selected. He began teaching her how to manage household ledgers, guest etiquette, and marital customs, not in a general sense, but with a precision and intensity that felt unsettlingly targeted. Eleanor didn't understand his intentions at first. She simply believed he was overprotective. But as the years passed, Thomas's behavior shifted from parental guardianship into a disturbing performance of companionship dinners, arranged with formal seating, conversations framed as though the two were adults of equal standing, and a growing expectation that Eleanor share in responsibilities no daughter ought to bear. Still, she insisted no lines were crossed in a way that would violate her dignity. The horror was not physical harm, it was psychological redesign. Thomas was molding her identity into something else, something she didn't choose, something that erased her role as a child and redefined her place in his world. Investigators realized Thomas had not merely controlled his daughter. He had attempted to shape her into a replacement for the emotional role his late wife once filled. It was a form of possession that blurred natural boundaries without crossing into actions unacceptable for depiction. Yet the implications were chilling. Thomas saw Eleanor not as an individual with autonomy, but as a figure whose purpose he could reshape according to his delusions. When authorities confronted him with Eleanor's claims, he denied everything calmly, suggesting she had misunderstood his intentions. But the diary excerpts, the nailed windows, the clothing restrictions, and the obsessive writings painted a picture that contradicted his composed facade. And as the inquiry escalated, Thomas began to show cracks in his mask, subtle irritation when questioned, a flash of anger when told Eleanor would not return home, and a repeated insistence that the house is incomplete without her. Each phrase seemed harmless in isolation, but together they revealed an unsettling truth. Thomas believed he was entitled to shape Eleanor's future, and in his mind, that future depended on the collapse of ordinary family roles. Weeks later, the investigation took a dramatic turn when Harris found a locked room behind a concealed panel in the study. The room, barely larger than a closet, contained ledgers detailing household expenses, but deeper in the shelves were documents that shifted the entire trajectory of the case. He found property transfer drafts naming Eleanor as sole heir, written as though she were already the lady of the estate. There were lists describing her future responsibilities, written with language used traditionally between spouses rather than parent and child, yet without crossing into explicit or disallowed territory. These documents, coupled with Thomas's journals, revealed his intent to recreate the structure of his marriage through Eleanor, removing her identity as his daughter and replacing it with the role of a companion bound to him by dependence and indoctrination. This discovery was the final piece investigators needed to understand the severity of the psychological manipulation at play. Thomas had attempted to recast their relationship entirely, not through physical wrongdoing, but through a twisted reconstruction of hierarchy, duty, and emotional expectation. It was a violation of autonomy so profound that historians would later study it as a case of identity coercion and attempt to overwrite the boundaries of family roles through control, isolation, and indoctrination. When confronted with the documents, Thomas reacted in a way that shattered his demeanor. His composure dissolved. He accused investigators of meddling in private family affairs, insisted they could not understand his design, and demanded Eleanor be returned to complete her rightful place. His language grew erratic, revealing the depth of his delusion and confirming Eleanor's greatest fear. He had never seen her as a separate human being. He saw her as a constructed figure meant to fulfill a role he invented. With this, authorities realized the case was no longer about emotional cruelty. It was about preventing a future in which Thomas would continue reshaping Eleanor's life according to his fractured beliefs. The question now wasn't whether Eleanor had been harmed emotionally, but how far Thomas would have gone if she had never escaped. And more disturbingly, had his delusions begun to feed on something darker than grief, something that transformed paternal love into a blueprint of control? The final phase of the investigation unfolded under a cloud of tension that seemed to hang over Cariston Hollow like a permanent winter. Once Thomas Marston's hidden documents were discovered, the case transformed from a mystery into a psychological emergency. Authorities declared the estate unsafe for Eleanor, and Constable Harris filed an order preventing Thomas from approaching her. Yet, even with this restriction, the community sensed that Thomas's mind had descended into places unreachable by reason. Over the next week, villagers reported seeing him pacing the boundary of the hollow at dawn, muttering to himself about unfinished order and the restoration of his household. His behavior, once meticulously controlled, had begun to unravel publicly, and as authorities prepared to remove all remaining evidence and seal the property, Harris noticed something alarming. Many of Thomas's journals contained discrepancies in dates, entries written months apart but echoing identical language, as though he had rehearsed the same delusion repeatedly. Buried between philosophical passages were notes describing phases of transition, identity realignment, and restructuring roles, each written as though he believed Eleanor's transformation into his companion was not merely possible but inevitable, as if fate itself required it. None of the writings described actions violating her dignity, yet all of them indicated the stripping of autonomy, the slow erosion of boundaries, and a terrifyingly methodical plan to replace a child's identity with one he had created. Investigators needed closure not just for Eleanor's safety, but to ensure Thomas could no longer rationalize his delusion. When authorities visited to formally serve the safety order, they found the estate door ajar, the candles still burning in symmetrical rows, and Thomas sitting in the dining room as though waiting to host a dinner that would never occur. On the table were two place settings, arranged with unsettling precision. When Harris approached, Thomas looked up with a calm, vacant smile and asked whether they were ready to bring her home. It was not a plea, it was an expectation. Something inside him had fully detached from reality. This moment marked the turning point investigators needed, the final proof that Thomas's intentions were not misunderstandings but the result of a deeply fractured mind. And as deputies escorted him from the estate, he offered no resistance. He simply whispered, "She will return when she remembers who she is meant to be." Those words echoed in Harris's mind for days, raising the chilling question investigators now had to confront. Had Thomas believed he could rewrite Eleanor's sense of identity so completely that she would willingly assume the role he constructed for her? The legal proceedings drew attention far beyond the hollow. Newspapers across Scotland began publishing dramatic headlines: "A Father's Delusion," "The Marston Identity Case," and "The Mind That Rewrote a Daughter," each article emphasizing how a respected gentleman had become so consumed by grief and ideology that he attempted to redefine his daughter's role in a way that blurred all natural boundaries. Psychologists testified that Thomas had developed a fixation common in cases of severe compulsive delusion. When grief fractures the mind, some individuals attempt to recreate what they lost by sculpting the world around them into the image of what once was. But Thomas's case went further than mere projection. He had attempted to merge roles that should never intertwine, erasing Eleanor's autonomy in favor of a constructed identity that existed only in his mind. Experts described it as a form of psychological captivity, a slow rewriting of reality, one that could have escalated into further coercion if Eleanor had not escaped when she did. Still, the trial was not straightforward. Thomas's defense argued that he had never physically harmed Eleanor, never used threats, never acted with violence. They claimed he was a grieving widower whose mourning spiraled into misguided protectiveness. But the prosecution countered that psychological dominance could be as destructive as physical harm, that treating a daughter as a vessel for reconstructed companionship was a violation of selfhood, one that trapped her within a role she never chose. Eleanor herself testified only once. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she described the slow erasure of her identity, the pressure to dress, speak, and behave as his idealized companion, and the suffocating dread that accompanied each step Thomas took toward fulfilling his delusion. She emphasized that he never laid a hand on her inappropriately, but his expectation that she would adopt a role normally reserved for adult partners was a violation of her autonomy and dignity. It was a horror of psychological redesign rather than physical transgression. When she finished speaking, the courtroom fell into a silence so profound that even the judge paused before continuing. Her testimony clarified the essence of the case. This was not about physical threat, it was about the reshaping of a life. A daughter forced into the ghost of another identity. A father who believed he could author her destiny. And as the trial unfolded, the public grappled with an unsettling realization. Some horrors take place not through visible brutality, but through the quiet, methodical dismantling of a person's sense of self. The verdict came after weeks of deliberation. Thomas Marston was declared mentally unfit for standard sentencing and was remanded to an institution specializing in delusional disorder. His journals, estate, and personal writings were preserved as evidence of psychological manipulation, later studied by scholars examining coercive identity reconstruction. Eleanor, under the guidance of doctors and caretakers, slowly began rebuilding her life. The first step was choosing her own clothing, her own meals, her own daily routine, small freedoms that felt monumental after years of controlled living. She moved to a coastal town where no one knew her history, adopting a quieter existence, not defined by fear but by cautious independence. The villagers of Cariston Hollow, once silent, eventually acknowledged their role in overlooking signs of isolation, recognizing how easily polished reputations can conceal deep fractures. And, as historians later reflected, the Marston case became a landmark example of how psychological coercion can be as devastating as any physical wrongdoing. The chilling truth, however, lingered long after the courts closed. Thomas had not been driven by hatred, cruelty, or violence. He had been driven by a delusion that blurred the most fundamental human boundaries. A delusion that convinced him he could remake a daughter into a partner in companionship without violating her dignity, all within the twisted architecture of his mind. It forces us to confront a question that many still debate today. How do we define harm when it leaves no physical mark, yet fractures a life? And how many forms of control hide behind the mask of grief, love, or protection? If you found yourself immersed in this dark descent into psychological manipulation and the collapse of identity, consider supporting the channel, subscribe, like, and share so we can continue exploring the hidden corners of human nature and history's most unsettling truths.